distinguished panel, the leaders of Nalanda, including the students and friends. This is my first time in ORF and first time in Nalanda. So I feel very honored that I've been asked to moderate this panel. But it sounds that it is a transformation. ORF is trying to stop all panels. That's what we just heard. So this may be the last series of panels that you might have, unless there is some change. I must tell you that my background is United Nations. I spent 20 years in the corridors of the United Nations in 4 capitals, UN capitals in the world. So you will not blame me if I'm somewhat pessimistic about the future of the world, because it is at the United Nations that the changes began. An institution which was set up to provide a new world order after the Second World War failed in a sense, and diplomacy has failed and wars have begun. The difference between the Cold War time and now is that at the time of the Cold War, United Nations was able to frame some formulae on the basis of what the Charter provides. A framework for peace, preventive diplomacy, peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building, etc. There was a pattern. At least a ceasefire was possible. But in the 21st century, if you look back, no war which started in the 21st century has stopped. In one way or the other, it continues. And perhaps the starting point of this was the Gulf War, the mother of all resolutions you must have heard about, which the Security Council adopted. And India was on the Security Council and I was present there. That particular resolution opened up all the principles that were considered holy and sanctified in the UN Charter. As a member of the Security Council, we were very pained to see these changes taking place through a Security Council resolution. But then we had to go along because UN was fighting a war. And it was essential for us to adjust our thinking in order to face the new situation. But now it has come to a point, the important point being the Trump plan for Gaza, a resolution which has been adopted by the Security Council. If you read it, you will find that every principle of the United Nations has been violated in one way or the other. But since Security Council resolutions are absolutely applicable to all members of the United Nations, I wrote something called Amendment of the Charter by Stealth. We are trying to amend the Charter without going through the process, because the founders of the UN Charter had believed that the Charter would be written in stone, as it were. Therefore, they made it very difficult to amend the Charter. That's we have a situation today that if you look at the list of the permanent members, you will still find the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics. You will find the reference to the enemy states. None of these could be changed because the procedure of all permanent members and two-thirds majority of the General Assembly agreeing is absolutely impossible. So this is the big change that has happened, and so perhaps the uncertainty and the problems that we see today arose out of the fact that we abandoned the structure of the United Nations. Maybe it was a historic necessity, but still this is what you have to look at. When you talk about the new world, I would say the absolute inefficiency and ineffectiveness of the United Nations because of the veto has been demonstrated very clearly. Nobody had imagined that a permanent member will wage a war against another member of the United Nations. The veto given to the permanent members was not a gift. It was a responsibility to keep the peace, and we have moved away from it. So really the topic of the panel is very important, at the same time very difficult to deal with. I shall just tell you one experience of mine. I used to write a New Year letter to all my friends and contacts every year. And I sat down this time to do the thing. But then my conscience would not permit me to wish a happy 2026, knowing so well that 2026 is going to be much worse than 2025. So I debated a lot whether on the occasion of the New Year, when you want to wish everybody happiness, would you like to bring in all these issues and difficulties? After much deliberation, I decided to do so. So my New Year letter became some kind of a pessimistic assessment of the world. But what I'd like to point out is that the response was very interesting. Most people around the world agreed with me and said this is a crisis situation. But people in India, most of them did not want to hear this. Many of them even told me, why are you disturbing our peace in the new year? Some people said these are exaggerated fears. So this is a new situation that people in India are very optimistic about the world and the people abroad are rather pessimistic. I found this was an interesting lesson and also important lesson for us because we are looking at India with hope while the rest of the world seems to be looking at the world in desperation. I don't know whether I'm exaggerating this. So this is what we have to think in terms of this. I'm not going to spell out what are the problems and difficulties of the new system. But certainly a new world order is necessary, but the contours of which are not yet seen. So as a result of that, what happens is that everybody is hedging. Nobody wants to commit to any kind of principle or any kind of situation because you do not know what your place in this new world order will be. And therefore, everyone is trying to, even the smallest of countries, think in terms of a role for themselves in the world order. And they believe that they must be active, at the same time, non-committal to alliances and others. That is why alliances have become weaker. BRICS was at one time considered to be an important organization, but now the United States take it as a rival to the US. What a dramatic change. It was an American economist who had suggested BRICS. So the alliances are crumbling, and that's all because we do not know where it will center around. And of course, with President Donald Trump, things have become more uncertain than before. So this is the context in which we are addressing this situation. And we have a very distinguished panel. I will stop here and request them to address these issues. Mine was purely a personal note. I have not discussed with any of them. And we can probably deal with that also in the process of discussions. Thank you very much. And let me call upon Sri Pradeep Chauhan, Director General, National Maritime Foundation, New Delhi, to make a presentation, 5 to 7 minutes. Thank you very much.
Morning, everybody. Let me first begin by saying thank you to the ORF and thank you to Nalanda. And now, without any further ado, I would like to present a few slides to you if they're working, and if they're not, you just have to make do with me proceeding along as best as I can. Like every other country, India has a set of geopolitical um, goals and another set of non-geopolitical goals. And in the process, we then try and work out strategies for the attainment of these geopolitical goals and geo-economic goals and the attainment of non-geo-economic goals. And the strategies that we then evolve need a set of insurance mechanisms and assurance mechanisms. The insurance mechanism is to do with what happens if my strategy doesn't work. And the assurance mechanism is, wo dekho chidiya chidiya, it will work. Now, that is an approach which every nation follows. And in order to provide for these respective strategies to work, we need these assurance and these insurance mechanisms, which put together are our foreign policy. So now, India's central challenge is really this, that the next 200 years are going to be centuries of the seas and of space, both outer space and inner or cyberspace. And in the course of these 2 centuries, 2 things will happen to India, which will define India's view of the world. The first is that if we are to maintain the territorial integrity of a geopolitical entity called India, which is cartographically recognizable. That means you look at the map and you should be able to say, this is India. Then for that, you need land power and aerospace power to create India and to maintain its cartographic identity. So now you got India. But since the next 200 years are going to be centuries of the seas and of space, to move India across into those 2 centuries, you will need to be a maritime and a space power, or else India will not be any kind of power at all. Consequently, we are faced with a peculiar geopolitical challenge, which is an enduring one. And that is, how should we balance our geopolitical land-based imperatives with our maritime imperatives? Now, here we are in Nalanda, which is about as far away from the oceans as you can get. And yet, you have a country, a setup, a geopolitical entity that can embrace a future only if it embraces the maritime movement. Does that mean that we shouldn't be looking at the land issues and the continental issues? Of course not, it doesn't. But our challenge will be, how do we balance? And how do we balance them in an increasingly uncertain world? And so now the question about who's causing the uncertainty is quite well known to this audience and doesn't need any great dilation. The points that are needed to be worried about is, all our lives we have spent in worrying about, this whole business of geopolitical competition or great power, rivalry, and that's the stuff that has enabled us to get the kinds of degrees that we have got in our lives. Degrees are not very important in my way of thinking. Even a thermometer has degrees, protractors have degrees, but you have to try and figure out what do you know, and rather than how many degrees do you have. So having said that dangerous sort of statement and made it in a major university of India, what if we're not seeing? I don't think we are seeing great power competition anymore. What we are seeing is great power collusion. And if we are seeing great power collusion, then is that what Mr. Trump actually wants? Is he looking to recreate the concert of Europe of the early 20th century? Does he not want a balance of power, but does he actually want a few strong men who will run the world in the fashion that the concert of Europe did? The problem with that is that history shows us that these concert of Europe kind of approaches, they end badly. They end with conflict, significant conflict. So similarly, does President Trump not want any supply chains? We are talking about supply chain resilience all the time, China plus one, so many approaches. But does Trump not want any supply chains at all? Does he want to onshore everything? And if it is his desire to onshore everything, then can such an everything actually be achieved? These are questions that are receiving less attention from us than they need. There are other countries involved as well. What should we do and how should we think about Turkey? What is to be done about Turkey? Should we think about Turkey as the upholder of international public, international and private maritime law, as is the case vis-a-vis the Montreux Convention? Or should we look at Turkey quite differently as a power that is in the Indian Ocean, letting loose gins from bottles that should never have been let loose, and which once let loose cannot be put back? So are we looking at a Turkey-run, Pakistan-supported, China propped up Quad, which is anti-India? Is that what we're looking at? Is that how we should look at Turkey? Or should we look at Turkey as a major influencer that we can actually utilize? India is faced with all of these issues. And if we contextualize everything that I've said so far in the international domain across to our own country, then we find we have peculiar issues with Russia. What should we do with Russia? What should I go quite frequently to Europe, and they always ask me, where are your ethics? Why don't you take a side? Don't you think it's about time that India took a side? And I keep telling them, I said, what have you been smoking here? And whatever it is, it's bad stuff. Go across, get some proper thing, be properly delusional. Don't smoke BD and be delusional on the cheap. Nothing is, we don't have to choose a side. We are a side. We are a side. You choose the side, not we. We are 1/6 of humanity. We are a third, fourth, something largest GDP on the planet, and we are growing. You are shrinking. What do you mean we have to choose a side? What is the West's worst nightmare? That there could be an axis which contains China, North Korea, Russia, and they think Iran, and I think Turkey. That's the worst nightmare. So the worst nightmare is for India that there will be a collusion between Russia and China that we won't be able to control. So therefore, Russia is not talking to Europe. Europe is not talking to Russia. Europe is talking at Russia. Russia is not talking to Europe. Russia is talking at Europe. Who is talking to Europe? Who is talking to Russia? We. So we are talking to Russia in organizations such as the SCO. We are talking to Russia in organizations such as BRICS. And therefore, it is in your interest, if you're European or you're American, to provide the heft that India needs. Because the question is not only whether we are talking to Russia, but why should Russia talk to us? So why isn't it a case of unrequited love? We talk to Russia, they talk to China. Why would Russia talk to us? It would talk to us only if we have heft in military terms, in informational terms, in diplomatic terms, in economic terms. Then Russia talks to us. Do you not want to know what's happening in the BRICS? Do you not want to know what's happening in SCO? These are the questions that we ask the Americans. These are the questions we ask the Europeans. That therefore it is in your interest to make sure not only that India is in these organizational structures, but that India is actually strengthened within them. Finally, we need to talk about China. And the narrative war that China is engaged in is what we need to talk about. All the four global initiatives, the global security initiative, the global development initiative, the global governance initiative now. The issue is that in narrative warfare, you need narrative. Narrative is a function of language. Language is a function of the humanities. And the ability of humanities to generate people in our country and elsewhere who can understand the nuances of language. Failing which, you will just be you will have only two options of approach. One reaction will be that we will get angry, and the other reaction is that we will sulk. And on the planet Earth, if there was to be a world record for countries which are capable of sulking, we have a very good chance of receiving the #1 award. We can really sulk. So consequently, when we look at China, we must understand which narratives we want to play, which narratives are being played against us. Where are they being played? They are being played in these institutions, in universities, not necessarily Nalanda, but in universities across India. This is the narrative game. Now we have to decide whether in this fractured world of Trump, whether in this fractured world of great power collusion, associated or supplanting great power rivalries, whether or not we are in a position to work an Indian narrative. It is not enough for us to be Atmanirbhar. This is my last point. It is not enough for us to be Atmanirbhar. We have to, it doesn't matter what clothing you wear, what dress you wear. This doesn't make you colonial or not colonial. What is required is Bodhik Atmanirbharta. Yani ki aapke between the left temple and the right temple, what is happening here? Is that colonial? Have you overcome that? Are you able to wrest a narrative from the world, whether it's Trump's narrative or it is the Chinese narrative? Are you able to supplant it with an Indian narrative? And what is that Indian narrative? Should we deride one language or another language? Do we become more Indian by... Sometimes I think that the British are very important to us. If they didn't exist, we would have been forced to invent them. Because how else to explain away all your infirmities? You need some other guy, it's all his fault. So my earnest plea as the Director General of the National Maritime Foundation in New Delhi is, let us create Bodhik Atmanirbharta. Let's create a narrative of India's, which is quintessential Indian. It doesn't have to be 8,000 years old or 6,000 years old or 5,000 years old. If it can be, great. If it can't be, no issue. But create a narrative. Do not end up with the only options being anger or sulk. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sri Pradeep Chauhan. We do need to create a narrative ourselves. Next on our panel is Srishti Pukram, Director, ACT East Center, and Visiting Fellow, India Foundation, New Delhi. You have the floor now.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone, and namaskar. To begin with, as I just have like 5 to 7 minutes as conveyed by the organizers, I would like to touch on the 3 questions that has been thrown out to each of the panelists here in our session: the state of the world, mapping power, disorder, and direction. My co-panelist, the previous speaker, has outlined an overview of each of the region. As I focus on ASEAN and Southeast Asia, I would like to bring in these 3 questions when we are talking about the state of the world, and how do I look or view this when we keep it into these 3 pillars. So the first question that has been raised in this panel is, in the ongoing consequential shifts in global power, say in influence and institutions which are structural versus cyclical, how must countries navigate these shifts? How can middle powers and emerging economies exert agency and amidst the great power flux, as we all are talking and discussing about? When I look at the ASEAN region, the structural shifts, I would say that are enduring, because we see that there is trade, technology, finance, and the supply chains, which are now tools of strategic leverage. For ASEAN economy especially, they're deeply embedded in the global value chains. So we see that there is economic openness, but it no longer guarantees strategic neutrality. Second, dependence management. It has become a security issue. And then when we are talking about the structural shifts which are enduring, the global governance is shifting from, I would say, universal institutions towards overlapping. Why do I say overlapping? There are minilaterals. Then there are issue-specific blocks. So ASEAN centrality, which thrives on the whole idea of the concept of ASEAN, of coming together, it's in fact structurally challenged by many of these multilateral groups, and then which are operating in parallel with ASEAN. And there is again declining faith in consensus-based multilateralism. That is one concern that is moving around ASEAN region. Second is the cyclical shifts. When we are talking about structural versus cyclical, cyclical shifts are reversible, unlike the structural shifts which are enduring. So mistaking cyclical turbulence for structural risk, in fact, structural change, it will risk over-alignment. So ASEAN, in terms of when we are studying the region, it has been observed that US engagement, to give an example, US engagement in Southeast Asia, it waxes and wanes, it based on domestic politics and other theaters like the Europe or the Middle East. But China's approach to the region, it shows periods of coercion also, like the South China Sea, the economic pressure, then also alternating with the reassurance diplomacy. So for ASEAN, when we talk about keeping each of these powers or in blocks or being aligned or being non-aligned, for ASEAN, hedging is in fact not an indecision. For ASEAN, it is rational statecraft. Hedging is a rational statecraft under uncertain times. So for why I'm saying that, this is indeed more of a, conscious decision, because it will engage they will engage all major powers without exclusive alignment, diversify security, economic and technological partnerships. So keeping this in view, ASEAN has, the ASEAN member states, they have been increasingly pursuing issue-based alignment, security with the US and partners, trade with China, then within the framework of RCEP, infrastructure financing from multiple sources. So for ASEAN, today's global flux is not a temporary disorder, but a prolonged transition. So it will continue kind of avoiding public alignment to preserve negotiation leverage. That brings me to the second question, which is how are economic and technological rivalries redefining alliances and dependencies across regions? Here again, when we talk about the member states of ASEAN, alignment is increasingly again determined. Like I said, hedging is their choice. It's not just a concept that they are picking it up. More of they are determined by the trade architecture, as we see in the framework of RCEP, the technology ecosystems, which is of 5G, semiconductors, cloud infrastructure, then the industrial policy linkages, which is of EVs, batteries, digital manufacturing. So this represents a kind of shift from formal security alliances to functional alignment. So ASEAN economies, they remain deeply integrated with China-led manufacturing networks, but again, simultaneously, they rely on US and partner-led technology and finance and standards. So it has become a critical area for supply chain reconfiguration when we talk about this particular region. So China plus one and friendshoring strategies, they redirect the investment to Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. But this increases ASEAN's economic leverage, but also it embeds it within the rival production ecosystems. So for ASEAN now, new dependencies have also emerged, like the semiconductor assembly and testing depend on US, Japanese, and Taiwanese technology, while we also see that there is rare earths and batteries and EV supply chains. Increasingly, they intersect with China-linked capital and processing. How they have responded to that is by avoiding exclusive technology ecosystems first. Second, by adopting mixed or interoperable systems where possible. Third, by delaying regulatory harmonization to preserve the flexibility. So in economic realm, at the ASEAN level, it has been that the emphasis has always been on inclusivity and open regionalism. Second, there has been resistance to exclusive economic blocs that force binary choices, and preservation of ASEAN-led forums as buffers against fragmentation. We see that every time when a new ASEAN chairmanship also takes over, with the theme they come in with each of their chairmanship, like for example, this year is Philippines. So navigating the future together, that is the main theme. So we see that there is a sense of inclusivity and going along together. At the national level, the response, it marks that the states pursue, like they have their different priorities, they pursue differentiated strategies based on exposure and capacity. Like I'll give you three examples of Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia. Singapore, it focuses on standards, finance, and digital governance. Vietnam, it leverages manufacturing, relocation while managing China dependence. Then Indonesia, it uses its resource nationalism to gain leverage in battery and EV chains. So what are the blind spots? Here, the mentioning about that brings me to the third question of the panel, is what are the blind spots in how policymakers, markets, and analysts are interpreting today's disruptions? So I have framed my discussion points mainly around the ASEAN region being that focus area of my study too, that the three blind spots that I see here is, well, first blind spot, assuming ASEAN states will eventually choose sides between competing blocs. They often treat, like I mentioned, that many of the analysts, the researchers, they often treat hedging is in indecision rather than as an intentional autonomy-seeking behavior. So we have to carefully study this. Second blind spot is interpreting supply chain reconfiguration, China plus one, friendshoring, as geopolitical disengagement. Because for ASEAN, diversification, it reshapes dependencies rather than eliminating them. So the third blind spot is assuming that trade and investment will automatically reduce conflict risks. Reality is that interdependence is increasingly asymmetric and weaponized. So ASEAN states, they now experience interdependence as both a growth engine and also a coercive vulnerability. So these are the main thoughts that I have centered around on the three questions that had been open to each of the panelists on this session. And to end my thoughts on this is that what we look at as blind spots is what there is a hypothesis, and we are looking at how is it, that it aligns with, or is it working against it, like treating ASEAN as a coherent strategic actor with uniform preferences. But reality is that ASEAN states, despite being one unit, we can't see all the 11 countries in one view. That is, it's each of the states, they differ widely in threat perception, economic structure, political systems, and external exposure. So unity is often procedural and it's not substantive. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Srishti. Well, I found it interesting that you are saying that for ASEAN, hedging is indispensable and not just a statecraft. That's rather interesting. And also the comment about China, pressure with reassuring diplomacy. That's a very fascinating phrase. Thank you. Thank you very much. So now we move on to Mr. Rajiv Ranjan Chaturvedi from the Nalanda University itself. He is associate professor here. Mr. Rajiv Ranjan Chaturvedi.
Namaskar and very good morning. Respected chair, dignitaries on dais, distinguished scholars from all over India, and my dear students. At the outset, I express my gratitude to Honorable Vice Chancellor Professor Sachin Chaturvedi and Professor Harsh Pant for giving me this opportunity. So I will also, as previous speaker, address three questions. I will also try to share my views on those three questions which have been posed to us. We are living in a world that feels unsettled. Power is spread out, partnerships are uncertain, truth is thin, old assumptions no longer hold. Many of the arrangements that once gave a structure to international affairs are struggling to keep pace with the way the world now works. The system created after the Second World War was designed for a time when power was concentrated, and leadership was clearer. Today, influence comes not only from states, but also from markets, technology, and networks that cross borders. At the same time, wars continue, terrorism persists, economies remain fragile, and climate pressures are rising faster than institutions can respond. The result is a growing gap between problems and the ability to manage them. This brings us to the first question. What do the weakness of post-war institutions, the strain within transatlantic partnership, and the expansion of BRICS tell us about the future of cooperation? And can cooperation survive without a single dominant power? For a long time, global order was built around the idea that one power or a small group of powers would act as the anchor. This idea came largely from Western experience. It assumes that stability required leadership by the United States and Europe. Over time, however, this belief has weakened. Institutions set after 1945 have often failed to stop wars or bring lasting peace. Their authority has been questioned, especially by countries that feel excluded from the decision making. The United Nations Security Council still reflects the power balance of another era. Many countries from the global south remain outside to its core structures. The strain within the transatlantic relationship also reflect the shift. Differences over trade, domestic politics, and international responsibilities have made collective actions harder. At the same time, the growth of BRICS shows that many countries want a greater role in shaping outcomes. This is not a rejection of cooperation. It is a demand for fairness and voice. Cooperation, therefore, does not depend on one country acting as a referee. It depends on shared responsibilities. It depends on respect. It depends on institutions that reflect today's world, not yesterday's. The second question follows naturally. Is a shared global agenda still possible, or are countries not driven only by their own interests? National interest has always mattered. That has not changed. What has changed is the level of interdependence. Financial shocks, health crisis, climate stress, and digital risk spread quickly across borders. No country can insulate itself completely. Like Amitabh Acharya describes today's system as a multiplex world order, a world with many centers of influences, overlapping rules, and different paths of cooperation. In such a world, cooperation is harder to organize, but it is still necessary. It's critical. A shared agenda is possible, but it will not look neat or uniform. It will be shared in a broad direction and flexible in practice. Countries may agree on goals while choosing different ways to reach them. We are also in a period of what has been called interdependence without trust. Long-standing partnerships have become more transactional. Economic ties are sometimes used as tools of pressures. This makes cooperation more fragile, but it also makes selective cooperation more important. What we see emerging is cooperation built around specific issues. Countries work together where interests overlap, even if they disagree elsewhere. Flexible coalitions are replacing rigid alignment. This is not very ideal, but that is the reality. This brings us to the third question. How can India help shape a shared agenda and a new form of cooperation between North and South? India's role begins at home. Internal cohesion, economic strength, and effective institutions are the foundations of external influence. As Professor Raja Mohan, in one of his writings, points out, that credibility abroad flows from capacity at home. And same thing reflects when Ramdhari Singh Dinkar writes in Kurukshetra, Sandhi vachan sam pujya usika jisme shakti vijay ki. So credibility is very important. Without domestic strength, international leadership remains limited. India's foreign policy has been guided by pragmatism. It has avoided permanent camps. It has focused on working with different partners on different issues. This approach suits a world where rules are often applied unevenly. India's approach to the world has been shaped by an inherited sense of what a political community should value, how it should act, and what kind of order it should aim for to build. Norms today are frequently spoken about, but not always followed. This has led to frustration, especially in the global south. India's response has been to lead by example rather than by instructions. Its digital public infrastructure, development partnership, and crisis support show how cooperation can work in practice. Like Sasi Tharoor offers a useful image when he says, if America is a melting pot, India is a thali. Different elements sit side by side, distinct yet connected. This is how India approaches cooperation, respecting diversity while working towards shared outcomes. India seeks to be non-Western without being anti-Western. It aims to be a friend to all while remaining beholden to none. It navigates a networked world with flexibility, building coalitions that serves national interest while supporting broader principles. South-South cooperation is central to this effort. When countries of the global South work together, their collective voices carries more weight. India's engagement in this partnership strengthens cooperation from the ground up. Finally, values must not be lost. Cooperation is not a weakness, fairness is not a luxury. The United Nations remains imperfect, but it remains necessary. As Dag Hammarskjöld once said, UN was created not to take humanity to heaven, but to save it from hell. The governance gap we see today reflects a world in transition. The real question is whether this transition leads to fragmentation or adaptation. India's role is not to dominate, but to demonstrate how cooperation can still work in a world without a single center of authority. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Rajiv Ranjan Chaturvedi. Yes, the Security Council today reflects a composition of the world of the past. But the discussions that we have had on reforms of the Security Council since 1979, when I was first in the United Nations, has only accentuated the problem. It has not solved it. And that is why we are more on the way to hell rather than to heaven as far as the UN is concerned. Thank you very much. We have two more speakers and just a few minutes. First is, of course, Mr. Ambassador Biren Nanda, my own tribe, he served last in Australia. Mr. Biren Nanda.
Thank you, ORF. Thank you, Nalanda. My presentation or the remarks I'm going to make revolve around three questions. How can we describe geopolitical competition at the apex of the pyramid? How do global conflicts and tensions affect geopolitical outcomes? And how do economic shocks affect the global economy? So the first question, how do we describe geopolitical competition at the apex of the pyramid? The world is unipolar in terms of security. The US has no peer competitor, but it is multipolar from the economic perspective. In terms of nuclear deterrence, there are three nuclear powers at the apex of the power pyramid, US, Russia, and China. But there are a number of great powers with nuclear weapons, UK, France, India, Pakistan, DPRK, and Israel. There are also a number of aspirants close to making nuclear weapons, like Iran. And if the US fails to live up to its promises of extended deterrence, Japan could well consider an independent nuclear deterrent. The complexity of an unequal multipolar configuration makes the turn to nuclear conflict more likely. My second question, how do global conflicts and tensions affect geopolitical outcomes? First, wars, for example, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and trade disputes like the US-China trade war, can cause severe disturbances in energy, food, and financial markets, leading to soaring commodity prices, sanctions, and a rethinking of trade alliances. Second, Venezuela and China are two major producers of heavy oil, which is used in refineries in the continental United States. A successful US capture of Venezuela would result in a flow of Venezuelan heavy crude to US refineries. It would also increase the supply of petrodollars. Third, the US and NATO lost the Ukraine war. The Russian economy suffered damage, but there was no economic collapse. Russia is still a peer competitor of the US. Fourth, The resource grab and resource denial could become a trigger for great power conflicts in the future. This brings me to my third question. How do economic shocks affect the global economy? Economic rivalry among great powers continues to be shaped by competition and cooperation in an interdependent world. Artificial intelligence presents a dual shock to the global economy, acting simultaneously as a potential engine for unprecedented productivity gains and growth, while also posing a systemic risk that could widen inequalities and trigger financial instability. The global economy has moved further away from globalization after the imposition of tariffs by the United States. The tariff war has imparted shockwaves to supply chains across the world. Economic security concerns, which were the driving force behind the realignment of global supply chains after COVID-19, has once again come to the fore. The burden of US tariffs has primarily been shared by foreign exporters and US importers. The US has used its economic leverage over tariffs to influence outcomes and to direct foreign investment to the United States. High octane tariff announcements and the disruption caused to the flow of goods and services have added volatility to stock markets and impacted international capital flows. Trade diversion, a direct consequence of US sanctions, US tariffs, is redirecting China's exports to markets in the global south, crowding out products from other countries. New tariff policies did not crush global trade, but rather accelerated a reconfiguration of supply chains, shifting the focus from efficiency first globalization to resilience first investment and favoring smaller allied trade blocs. The balance of leverage is with the United States. China's leverage is rare earth and the financing of US debt. The US's leverage is the weaponization of the international monetary system and the US trade with the rest of the world. Middle powers are exploring payment systems outside SWIFT. They're looking for settlement currencies other than the US dollar. The freezing of sovereign Russian assets by EU nations is the single most important reason for this. The decline of the petrodollar has contributed to these developments. Public health crises and pandemics like COVID-19 disrupted health systems, caused labor shortages, enforced border closures, and dramatically shifted consumer demand patterns. Large-scale climatic events such as hurricanes, floods, droughts, and wildfires can disrupt production, damage infrastructure, and create long-term environment and socio-economic challenges. Economic and financial crises include events like the 2008 GFC, which originated in the US housing market and quickly spread globally via the financial system linkages, leading to recessions and job losses. Technological and cyber risks are high impact events involving technological failures. Large scale cyber attacks can severely affect global stability and disrupt increasingly digitized supply chains. Global shocks are often interconnected. A disruption in one sector, for example, the semiconductor manufacturing, could lead to widespread shortages and production halts in others. Shocks disproportionately affect vulnerable and marginalized populations and developing economies that may lack the financial buffers or the diversified trade partners to cope effectively. Supply shocks, in particular, often lead to cost push inflation, where the increased cost of production and transport forces consumer prices upward. 2025 saw a continuation and acceleration of ongoing shifts in political, economic, and energy power at a global, national, and local levels. Policy responses to global shocks include the diversification of supply chains and policy interventions like stimulus packages. Using AI for predicting future trends is also the way forward. Some changes like technology, business cycle, and recessions are cyclical. Others like demography, climate change, and the move away from dollar-denominated trade settlement system are structural and will ultimately impact on economic power equations at the global level. To deal with structural changes, we will have to first understand them and then adapt. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Birenanda. I cannot help making a comment on Venezuela in the context of the changing world order. There is increasingly a feeling that the intervention by United States in Venezuela was a blessing in disguise, because this might lead to better life for the Venezuelans. And this is an idea which is dangerous, but that is becoming more prevalent. And Mr. Trump has actually increased his popularity rather than decrease it by the action in Venezuela is something which we have to take note of. And finally, Swati Arun, you have exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds. Please. Take it.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I will be rushing through my presentation so we can have some time for Q&A. So whatever I don't discuss here, you may ask me later. So we meet today when we already have seen that how the old order is dismantling each and every day we see it. And the problem is that during this transition period, the new order has not yet come about. There are no consolidatory frameworks which will enforce stability. In fact, the way we are going today, each and every sector, each and every dimension in the international order is moving towards destability. We can see that there is robust capacity building, resilience, and military buildup going about across the world at the same rate. And why? To meet these new challenges that were unforeseen earlier. And this is the time for preparation, consolidation, and new changes, new partners, new promises that we will see in the foreseeable future. We are entering a phase here which is led by competition and not cooperation. And this is the primary mode of operation. Structural transformations will define the following period because several poles are emerging: China, US, EU, and to a limited degree, Russia. But since there are no frameworks yet, the destabilizing factors will increase, because now partnerships and alliances might be made on issues instead of around a stable world order. There is a blend of geoeconomic and geopolitics that we have already seen, how economic instruments are used as strategic leverages, which is also likely to continue and in fact tighten even further. We can see that there is a China plus model going on, which has become a norm. But that doesn't mean that now that these poles have come about, that the resources will be globalized as they used to be. In fact, resources will also be restrained to certain hemispheres and sphere of influences. So Asia is likely to get more dependent on China and extend its dependencies, which will lead to certain increased coercion, because China does have territorial problems and disputes in the region. The flashpoints like Russia, Taiwan, and Philippines will remain. And in fact, these are the ones that will decide how our future looks like. In my opinion, the US will resort to being an offshore balancer, where it will fortify its backyard, but also maintain some interest and protect those interests overseas, as we have seen in the NSS 2025, how it has been already clearly defined. I would say these are structural shifts, and they are not cyclical, because election cycles and quarterlies are not going to change them. And why I say this is because once in defense modernization has come about, you cannot change it. You can't undo it. For example, once space race has begun, it's very hard to undo it. Once military buildups are going around across the region, it's not easy to control it and restrain it. So it's very likely that these changes are going to go on for decades. And there is also one point to mention here, that if we see structural changes as cyclical, there is going to be miscalculations. So we must identify which are the cyclical changes and will change and which are not. So this new world order is likely to emerge as a very resource-centric. As I said, resource-centric, I must also mention that since we are talking of securities, etc., China is not going to be a replacement. Its will and capacity, as we have seen, to fight others' wars are almost non-existent. But that doesn't mean the same for its own region, which is South China Sea. So its focus is it will focus more on its own region and backyard, South China Sea, maintaining the control and command over the region and not invest so much overseas. As the Venezuelan question had come about earlier, China has big interest in Venezuela, has invested a lot, but nothing came more than strong words. There is no action plan there, and there likely will not be any. We may also see what happens when Cuba gets into some sort of problem with the US. Is China going to do anything, or Russia is going to do anything? It's very unlikely. What can India do? So India cannot opt out of this competition. The best tools that India has is strategic autonomy and its diversified partnerships. So during this time, it will be a proactive country that will be best suited to face the new challenges, unpredictable times. So what can India do is tech and trade hedging. It should align itself with multiple poles, build domestic capabilities in critical sectors and avoid overdependence. It should shape institutes like BRICS and expand alternate forums to try and build consensus, which will be the hardest thing to do in the future, and consensus on inclusive governance norms, such as on AI, digital trade, data, etc., climate. India would require to build partnership based on its regional security challenges. For India to exert its agency, it will require industrial capacity, tech absorption, regulatory competence, and diplomatic agility. Autonomy without capacity is an illusion, and we must make a note of that. Economic and tech rivalries will go on, and alliances and partners are likely to be made on shared supply chains and not on shared principles. And we are redefining today who's trusted, who is essential, who is expendable. And the world is almost relearning how power works, actually. So these trade dependencies will become new channeled and will not be eliminated. The tech standard bodies, development banks, regulatory regimes will now matter almost as much as military alliances once did. However, disorder does not mean collapse. In every adversity, there is opportunity, and the opportunity lies with a lot of middle powers. They will have, in fact, a lot of scope and space to build consensus among each other and drive international rules and governance norms according to what they believe, because there will be power and strength and in numbers as well. So lastly, there will be many domestic failures, domestic challenges that will then in the future will be defined or labeled as geopolitical. So there needs to be that difference as well, because we cannot ignore the political economy of a country. So there will be more and more reliance on foreign interference and foreign countries doing something inside another country and be labeled as geopolitical, while these will be actually domestic governance failures. For example, blaming inflation on other countries and levying tariffs is one example of how domestic failures will be labeled as geopolitics. Thank you very much. I will wait for your questions.
Thank you, Swati. Unfortunately, we have no time for questions. So therefore, I will also refrain from making any comments on the presentations. They are all very complete. Of course, we did not answer all the 3 questions in that order. It was not my intention. The idea was to get everybody to focus on something that he or she considers important. And I think we succeeded in that. And what remains is only felicitation for the panel.